Bonjour à tous, bonjour à toutes. Eh bien, bienvenue dans cette session intitulée « Gagner la bataille du soft power ». Je vais tout de suite présenter...
We're going to talk about soft power. I will do a short introduction to give time for questions and everything. So I will introduce our speakers briefly and let our speakers... So we, Khadija AL SALAMI, born in Yemen, she's a producer. She'll be remotely... Pierre BUHLER, a former ambassador in Poland, who was also the president of the French Institute. Adam Price, scriptwriter, showrunner, Danish creator, so I think everybody knows him without knowing him. He is notably the author of the series Borgen, excellent series. And we have Hubert VEDRINE, former Minister of Foreign Affairs in France, you all know him. And it was just published a sum up of all his important texts under the title A Vision of the World. So we will start right now. I have introduced the participants with a few introductory words. So winning the soft power battle. The title may sound weird because we're in the middle of a war without power, but the hard power, military power, can be conjugated with soft power. So I'll give you an example which is not necessarily known, the Poly Chinese conglomerate. Maybe you know it, giant of Christie's, like Christie's, and enterprise specialized in armament. Okay, auction sales, created in 1984, and the name was chosen in reference to the Chinese Liberation Army. When you see these Chinese policies in China on soft power, they're present. You have poly, but generally speaking, the Chinese soft power is the Silk Roads, which have the patrimonial heritage dimension. There will be an exhibit in the Louvre. The creation of China-Africa, for example. This put the African countries in debt, but it's also revolves around soft power. We can add things on the cultural aspects, cultural standpoints. I'll be brief. A museum in Dakar, the Confucius Institutes. So the concept was defined by Joseph Nye in 1986, who was a teacher in Harvard and former Secretary of State to the National Security of the Carter administration. And never did out. It's a bit fuzzy. This was decline in soft power, the need for a strong army, but also alliances, partnership, institutions at all levels. And since 2016, it was changed into sharp power, the whole of the soft power as it exists with authoritarian government. So soft power developed strongly. We see Korea with music, South Korea that is, with a great book by Sylvia Todd, and we see with how through music, what we call the K-pop, Korea, South Korea, a nation of industrialists, hardworking, and the world imagery, it's starting to shift to a peaceful and modern state. And so just a word on Ukraine. To conclude this introduction, a few words on Ukraine. There was Eurovision. You can say it's kitsch, it's just nothing, but as you see, Ukraine won the Eurovision. Russia was excluded from this competition. It had organized the Olympics in 2014, the Eurovision in 2009, the Football Cup in 2018, but Ukraine used this platform, this moment, to assert talk about its history, what's happening today. It used it as a platform to highlight the revisionist positions of the Kremlin when they talk about the history of war, they're affected by. So we can mention a lot of things, the work that was done by Russia today in Sputnik, which are officially banned in the EU. Just a few examples. So I turn immediately after this very quick introduction to Khadija. I turn to Khadija Salami. You were here with us, Khadija. So when we prepared this session together, you told me that as the war in Yemen is a war without images, Saudi Arabia is justifying this war by using its soft power. So what did you mean by that? Can you say a few words on your experience? You've done some very courageous documentaries on the war in Yemen. Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to thank you and Elliot for inviting me in this conference. I'm very honored, and it's true. Nobody talks about Yemen, and at the same time, I'm happy to see that in our country and the world is mobilizing to defend Ukraine against the Russian aggression by bringing financial and military assistance, or by making us aware, thanks to all the people involved in soft power. So we have the proof here of the efficiency of soft power to influence people everywhere in the world. It's a normal reaction that the international community has this reaction. But we have countries like Yemen, which is aggressed by a neighboring country, Saudi Arabia, and since 8 years, and this unjust war was criticized by the UN and also by international observers. And they say it's one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. And so I don't want to go into details of this tragedy and the sufferance of the Yemenites, who are today totally abandoned by the international community, because this is not our topic for today. But how can you explain that countries that are meant to ensure the respect the human rights, they contest the war in Ukraine with such determination as we see it every day? We've seen in the last 4 months, while these same countries do not talk and shut their eyes on what's happening in Yemen. Some countries supply weapons and information and intelligence to the aggressors, and so, which is unacceptable. It's sad, and they let this happen. There are the West. You know, there's not a good dictator or a bad dictator. You know, they're violating the human rights, and so there shouldn't be two different approaches on that. And soft power, we know, are very efficient weapons for their propaganda and to propagate their lies. For example, Saudi Arabia in the war in Yemen has mobilized an incredibly powerful media machine in order to justify its war against a sovereign state. The televisions, radio, written press, digital press, they've recruited an army of experts in their social networks. And even with Twitter, they recruited agents to track anybody who criticized the regime so they can eliminate them. The regime tolerates no criticism, as the case of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi Arabian journalist who was murdered in the Istanbul consulate because he dared denounce the last of freedom of speech and the lack of the respect of human rights in Saudi Arabia and the involvement of Saudi Arabia in Yemen. The Saudi regime forbids the access to Yemen to journalists. And so not only do they count on their own media, but they have also paid millions of dollars to large communication companies in France, Great Britain, and the US to hide their crimes and disseminate good images of their Machiavellic regime. This cost them millions of dollars to vehicle their lies. We should be ashamed. And they put women and men, Yemeni men and women in prison. I'll give you an example. Oh, sorry, you only have a minute left. I'm sorry. So just one example. They use fake news to justify the destruction of Yemen. The United Nations are against the bombing of the port on the Red Sea, that the other Yemeni ports are controlled by Saudi Arabia and are protected. So what they did to legitimate the bombing of the port, for 1 week the Saudi Arabian media said that they got top secret information that they would organize a press conference to unveil the reasons for the attack. Everybody's waiting for this conference, and so we see that they're used Iranian weapons. I'm sorry, but your message is very clear. It's a war that we do not talk about enough in our Western countries. I'm sorry. So I will hand over the floor, but you can come back in the debate later. Sorry. So Pierre BUHLER, the floor is yours. Can you shed a light on these wars of influence, on which you wrote a very interesting article with Frédéric Charillon? Yes. Thank you, François. So without going over the genealogy of the concept of soft power, on the definition of soft power, which dates back to the end of the Cold War, and which seemed to be confirmed by this concept is such that it is one of the most broadly used in international relationships. All countries have adopted these methods, with all countries that had an active cultural diplomacy, like France, the United Kingdom, and we all discovered soft power. Other countries have joined into this this approach, and the initial objective was to be attractive, to use them as influence tools. An example, and Françoise mentioned it, is that of the Confucius Institutes. China created some 550 Confucius Institutes worldwide that are vehicles to penetrate the Western academic world, and it gave rise to a reaction with the closing of a few hundreds of them. But you see all these propaganda machines that are under the soft power, and they're working full blast. I think Ms. Salami gave us a good example with Saudi Arabia, but we see that Russia Today, Sputnik, the troll plants, the Chinese broadcasting company with the CGTN logo, discrete logo, and the use of higher education abroad. China has 700,000, now before the COVID, they had 700,000 students in Western universities. And that boiled down to be sort of like a force broadly used by the Chinese Communist Party. So this, as far as the tools are concerned. And if we want to talk about the battle of soft power, a few words on the message. Because in the end, this battle of soft power is a battle of narrations with stories, with the need to rewrite history. And here I would quote Joseph Knight, who was saying that in the era of information era we're in, what's important is the victorious narration. And it was something that was adopted by authoritarian regime. There's one that is distinguished. There is Russia. Putin turned into an historian-in-chief, rehabilitating the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact agreement, blaming the Second World War to Poland, made them responsible, with a very vigorous reaction of the European Parliament by talking about the heroism of the Great Patriotic War, by persecuting anybody who would go against this memory. The memorial institution was dissolved recently, and he did that 2 years before the invasion of Ukraine. So he decided to refuse to recognize the existence of Ukraine, talking about a genocide in Donbass with made-up proofs justifying their invasion by the presence of Nazis in Ukrainian or chemical weapons present on the territory. All this is a way of questioning history. We see the same thing in Turkey, where a national myth is being constructed based on the Ottoman state, and legal actions taken against researchers who criticize these actions. We're talking about Poland, China. Well, we mentioned the Confucius Institutes, but we can also talk about the presentation of a new history in China. While Confucius was condemned by Mao, his inheritor, Xi Jinping, is trying to turn Confucius in a promotion, a PR argument, presenting an harmonious China with a lot of surveillance in the country. I don't know if you've noted this episode of an exhibit project on Genghis Khan in the museum in Nantes, in the north of France, that had to be cancelled because the Department of Propaganda of the Communist Party wanted to rewrite the catalog by banning the name of Genghis Khan, the word of Mongolia from the catalog. And so, Pierre, thank you very much.
C'est-à-dire le catalogue et la carte.
The catalog and the map of the world of soft power is so impressive. So thank you for sharing with us an impressive catalog of everything. So we will go over that in our discussion. So Adam Price, very well known for Borgen. You all know that. 60 countries, I think, broadcasted your series. Excellent series, I'm saying. Borgen, and with Borgen, the world has learned to know about the functioning of the Danish democracy. In an article I read that Soft Power, how TV shows like Borgen put Denmark on the map. So you put Denmark on the map. Were you aware of that when you started to work on this series? And for you, maybe another question, does the cinema, which was the well-known vehicle of soft power, did the cinema lead the way to series?
It's a great honor to be here. No, of course, we didn't know anything, actually, that we were supposed to be a series that would be aired all over the world. We didn't know about that. I just wanted to write a political show, and I didn't know that I was going to be part of the soft power, basically. But I wanted to write about politics, and I didn't know how to do it. But then there was a bit of anger inside me, and anger is not a bad feeling to write on, you know, because it actually has a great driving force. My generation in Denmark was accused of being non-political, because the former generation, the famous generation of '68, they changed the society. They brought the equality of the sexes, brought women to the jobs, and changed the world. And we were basically the parasites of that revolution. So we were accused of that, and I got somewhat angry from that, because I was also, when I was a young person, there was very strong images of political struggle in my world. When I was 18, 19 years old, there was the falling of the Berlin Wall. There was the great uprising on the Tiananmen Square. And those were very strong images of people fighting for democracy, basically. And then one day, I was actually, just to tell you how Borgen actually came about, I was standing in a very profane place, my fitness studio, next to a very huge, tattooed, muscular man. And right at that time, the television was showing the news. And the Danish Prime Minister at the time, who actually was a speaker here a few days ago, Mr. Anders Fogh Rasmussen, was announcing the election. And the election is supposed to be the heyday, the party day of democracy, right? And this huge guy next to me said the beautiful words when he heard the election was announced, "Fuck, count me out." And then I thought, if I could write a show that would make this man vote, then we would really be doing something good with the soft power of fiction. So basically that was the driving force. Basically to sing a song about democracy. And that is not necessarily always a pretty song, but it is a very, very necessary song to sing, especially in these years. So I very much acknowledge to be a part of this fight, this soft power fight. There was a survey actually in Denmark by the Copenhagen Business School because we were accused, Borgen, the series, was accused of being biased. We wanted to move people in a social liberal way when they voted. And I was a bit afraid that, are we actually biased here? Are we trying to move people with our soft power? So they did a survey around the core viewers of Borgen if they were actually being moved politically by the show. And I'm so happy that the Copenhagen Business School, the completely unbiased survey of the show, came to the conclusion that we actually enhanced the political interest of our viewers, but we didn't move them politically because they were actually able to make the difference between, you know, fiction and real life. But still, I very much acknowledge to be part of this soft battle. And I think in these years where we actually, just like you said, Pierre, where we experience huge regimes trying to rewrite history, I think there's more need for the voice of the artist than ever. And I very much acknowledge to be part of this fight, and I think we need to take it on us. And it's not necessarily going to be a pretty fight. We see examples of this also in Europe. We see examples in Poland or Hungary, just to mention a few, where we are also in our backyard basically seeing history rewritten. Is the EU up for that fight? I very much hope so. If not, it needs to be fought by soft means of the narrative. And I would, hopefully, I would very much like to join that fight. There's also a war, a tragic war going on right now, not only in Yemen, but also in our backyard in the Ukraine. Very much a fight that needs to be taken on also by the soft power. Can we afford to lose that fight? I really don't think so. I need to stop.
Merci beaucoup pour cette présentation.
So thank you very much for this presentation, for defending democracy. And we really need that. Hubert VEDRINE.
Alors vous dites.
Earlier you were saying, before we came on stage, that you were questioning the concept as a thinker today in geopolitics, and when you yourself were the Minister of Foreign Affairs. The floor is yours. Just a quick word about the concept and to answer the question. On the concept, I know Junayan, and they said that the US were dominant in terms of power. They did 100 times more. When we're worried today that they have their own narration, but we can have a more subtle use of our power. At the beginning, soft power was a very soft use of power. And then he perfectioned it and said we have to be smart. We can do this in an intelligent manner. It became a relay for power. When I'm talking about an era where there were hyperpowers and that people could have their own stories seemed grotesque. We won, that was it. We won. It's not old. We could do an analysis. Do all powers work on soft? No. Russia has power, but not much soft power. Can there be soft power without power? Yes. NGOs, some brands. There's an analysis to be done, but this is not the right forum. But we need to really refine the term. The Europeans gave it a very positive definition, and I think it's a lot more complicated than that. We're always talking about power, the power fight, and the word power is even too much in some cases. Are we confusing this with just the rayonnement, just our influence that we can have? France is the #1 tourist destination in the world. That's not power, but it is influence. People have in mind Louis XIV, de Gaulle, the Loire castles, etc. There's influence, but there's no power there. So I'm going to stop that there on those considerations. In the question, I don't understand who we're talking about, really. Who is we? Can we win? We, the Western population, Westerners in the widest sense of the term, the answer is no, we've lost. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had the vote at the United Nations. 140 countries voted against Russia, but 40 didn't want to take a stand. 40 representing 2/3 of humanity. So this is the reinvention of non-alignment. China, India, Indonesia, a lot of African countries. So if our huge soft power for decades, and we could go back to the US and Walt Disney, etc., we wouldn't have seen Xi Jinping in China. He wouldn't have dared. And along the line of Deng Xiaoping, we wouldn't have seen this belligerent attitude from the Islamic countries either. So can we re-win? And I don't think so, given what I've just said. I think it's a Western concept. Dominique de Villepin and myself, we talked about it at another round table. It's a concept that won't hold over time, given what's going on in the US, too. It's a country that is at the edge of imploding, and they're emitting concepts and their supposed influence. Will Europeans think of something different? Separate, specific, I don't know. So brutally, I would answer the question saying, it's possible that we won't lose, but it depends on what we put in the message. And the real problem of democracies, because we're mixing democracies, human rights, etc., it's not just Putin's horrible war. It's not the insolent declarations of the Chinese. It's the internal crisis in democracies. Democracies aren't working so well anymore. It's absolutely frightening what's going on in the US. In the UK, it's very strange. So there's a problem in democracy because most people don't want to be represented anymore. They don't want to vote. What the elites condemn as populism, populisms detest people who condemn that. So we're feeding the fire. We're feeding extremism when they're condemned by political elites that the people hate. They prosper in the light. So there's a big problem of democracy, and it's an illusion that we can regain on the surface of the planet the influence that we lost, or the monopoly that we had. But we just need to defend our civilization that we're viscerally attached to. If we don't find a consensus again with the people, with the populations, that consists in finding a reasonable answer for government, for the demands of people, to identity, sovereignty, managing migratory flows that the elites find disgusting and have been rejecting for years, saying it's racism and fascism. If in democracy we can't find a summary of this, we won't win, we won't recolonize the world, but just to defend who we are and to have influence in an acceptable manner by others, a manner that others find acceptable, rather. Perhaps a question to launch the debate. Has France moved in too many directions, or was it a bit too cheap in its soft power, influence, rather? at an international level with a strategy that's not always very clear. What do you think about that? I think it's the battle of language. It's not the case of all countries. But for France, for Louis XIV, from Versailles, language was a determining factor. In America invented globalization, the globish, the topic, it's not English, Oxford English, it's globish that everyone's speaking. And France has lost its influence because of these language issues. And I think that French needs to defend itself. We need to speak French better. The Germans need to defend their language. The Italians, everyone needs to defend their language. And the automatic interpretation systems are almost perfect. So are human interpreters. So the Chinese they're not working in English. So yes, we've been too dispersed in France. We're a bit pretentious, and we have a non-effective policy. I agree with that. But France needs to refocus on some key elements. And what are the key elements? What are our vital elements? We need to do a little housekeeping in our own country first. Are there questions from the room? But they're all, if we have Mrs. Al Salami, I cut you off a bit quickly, but you've produced documentaries that were broadcast on French TV. Was there wide dissemination of your work, or did you have difficulties? Most of my films have been broadcast on several different channels or media. The topics that I focus on are very sensitive topics. And it was my compass to fight against injustice. The camera is the tool that I use for this, to fight this battle. Images speak more than words do and can reach millions of people very easily. That's why I use images to reach spectators, especially in Yemen, so that they realize how serious the situation is. When I did a film on very early marriages, which is the topic in Yemen, my objective was to show the real problems that caused these child marriages and why it was so harmful to society. This ancestral tradition was very harmful. The film, when it was presented in Yemen, obliged families to think more about the question. At first, it was difficult to present the film. I was threatened, I was arrested, but parents did see it and did think about these questions. And it encouraged people to talk about their own experience, women to talk about it. So there was a type of mobilization of women's organizations to put pressure on the parliament and to vote a law that would forbid child marriages. Unfortunately, the war in Yemen stopped everything, and the rights of women and children fell by the wayside. So the questions have come in on my tablet. Two related questions. How can we ensure that France finds its soft power from the past? And why is France regressing in terms of soft power? Who would like to answer that one? I'll answer the first question. How can we regain our soft power? I think there's an essential battle to be waged. That's the battle of ideas. France is the country of the Enlightenment. The philosophers who practically invented political liberalism that then blossomed in the United States and outside of the North America also. But I think we clearly need to say that not that there are two models, but there are two blocks. On one side, there are dictators and authoritarian regimes in the world that are based on manipulation of information, disinformation, propaganda, lies that they've built up into a system with what is behind this, arbitrary decisions, intimidation, censure, repression. And I invite you to look at the joint declaration of Putin and Xi Jinping in February in China, where these heads of countries talked about democracy. They both claim to be democrats and implement democracy in their countries. It's Orwellian. And there's another block of values that's based on law, our values that create Europe and France, representative democracy, liberty, truth, the value of truth in a world of post-truth. Hubert VEDRINE said this very clearly, and these values have been corroded and challenged. In the US, we saw this with Trump, but also in Europe and some European countries. So it's up to France and up to Europe to preserve this capital that's been produced over centuries, the centuries of enlightenment, and to fight for Europe in its diversity, to stay the political compass and moral compass of the Western world. Hubert Védrine. We don't have time to develop this. I agree. I also disagree with some things. There are a lot of people in the world, in the famous 40 countries, that didn't want to take a stand, and in a lot of intellectual environments where people think that the Western world has been lying to them and forcing an inexact view of history on them. So people think a lot about this, about American policy. That's why, as Pierre said, the solution is not an easy one. It's not right in front of us. But I think Robert Badinter made when he heard France, the country of the human rights. No, it's the country of the Declaration of Human Rights. That's not the same thing. We've never had a magic wand to transform our country into a place that really protected human rights. I think the question is more complicated, and I have another comment. The last time France had a real influence was at the time of Derrida, Foucault, where we were creating the basis of woke culture in the United States with a very American approach. They created modern excommunication. They prevented people from teaching, from talking. Those who don't think in the same way as you were excluded. And that's why Obama intervened several times against this new culture. I agree that we need to relaunch the battle of ideas. But which ideas? So she said, "Thank you, madam," and Mr. Védrine said, "We don't care." I have a question for Adam Price. Can we have European soft power beyond nations with different languages? In other words, will we have another season of Borgen with Brigitte Nibor as a European commissioner?
Unfortunately, I'm not able to answer it completely because, of course, it's not up to me. It will be up to Netflix and also the owner of the rights, which is the Danish National Broadcasting Service, if they are going to do another season. But let's see. Definitely, I would. I have a lot of stories, and there are several people that are also bringing us stories about the EU. And just as I said before, there are also countries within the EU that are interpreting the concept of democracy in ways that I think is very damaging, and I think we need to take that discussion. And I would very much like to use the soft power of the narratives that I control personally to bring that debate into the 190 countries that are currently serviced by Netflix. I believe that, of course, language is important, but story knows no language. Stories can actually break down barriers, and I think we need to use narrative to bring down barriers and basically to connect us as human beings. The problem is when big countries basically cut off their populations and narrow the conversation down to basically the tyranny conversation between the holders of power and their populations, as we're seeing it in the various tyrannies around the world. Just before the war in Ukraine, Russia could still see Netflix. They don't at the moment. China is not seeing Netflix as well. So, I mean, that is the real problem also, that if we are to use the soft power of the narrative of cinema and television, we need to access the audience. And if the audience are cut off, then we have a problem, because then we have the parallel societies with two different truths. But I think we have to narrow it down to that there are elements of democracy that cannot be discussed. And we need to make that clear also within the EU, I think, personally. And if there were to be a 5th season of Borgen, I think we should bring that topic in.
Yeah, there's a question here from the back of the room. If you can take a microphone there, please. Thank you. Thank you for your testimonials. I have a question, a bit frustrated. We're talking about regaining soft power. We're not talking about our objectives. You talked about qualitatively, but quantitatively. What is the objective? What are the objectives? What do we want to win? What do we want to earn? You haven't talked about soft power measures. What is the objective? What do we want to achieve quantitatively? Pierre? I think that the first objective would be to stay loyal to our values and to the principles that rule over our lives, at least in Europe and the US and part of the world. Maybe I have some disagreements with Hubert VEDRINE. It's true that democratic regimes can be surprised or can be caught lying. And the difference between authoritarian regimes is that you don't end up in jail when you lie. You increase your reputation. You improve your reputation. You have. You could say that there's a permanent debate. It's called the democratic debate. And in these countries, 40 countries that have supported Russia, or let's say abstained. Some countries are not among them, are not really advanced in terms of freedom. China, for Adam's right to say that Netflix is not broadcasted in China. 1.3 billion individuals don't have access to that. 5 or 6, I'm sorry, I didn't hear the beginning. 5 or 6 countries abstained, did not choose to support or condemn, including Russia. Russia did not vote, and 20 African countries also. Yeah, okay. They did not support, they did not want to support automatically the West. I'm sorry, he's talking about the West, supporting the West. But there are a lot of dictatorships, we saw that with Salami in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, in the Middle East, in Africa, Asia, dictatorships where you end up in jail for telling the truth. It's the case in Russia, and you're deprived from the soft power tools that are to which we all have access. Never forget that China and Russia use their the social networks that they ban in their countries. Facebook, Twitter, they no longer exist in China or Russia. There are social networks that are organized locally, but this battle of ideas cannot be on the same standpoint. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but defending our model without being proselytes or defending human rights at all costs, and that Hubert VEDRINE denounced, stick to our guns. Sticking to our guns would be a first victory, and defend ourselves from all the intrusion, because it's the Western democracies that are, in the end, the target of all these dictatorships who use the weapons of soft power. Alan Price, maybe a word on this?
I think the narrative of fiction, it has an advantage, because it is not the truth. It is not journalistic truth. It is a beautiful dream. And when we in Denmark were occupied by the Germans during the Second World War, we did a lot of fiction that dealt with oppression. But we didn't talk about the Germans. We didn't talk about the real problems, but we talked about something that was very close to it. Thereby, we were able to actually have a secret opposition in the songs, in the plays, in the narrative going on. And I think that is perhaps a way that the soft powers can also arrive in countries that would abstain from the real truths, but as long as it's a story, they don't necessarily recognize it as political. And that's where we as writers need to fight the war behind the lines. Yes.
On a une question dans la salle.
Question from the floor. Sir, can you hear? My question is for Hubert VEDRINE. My name is Guillaume Geoffroy-Jassy. I'm responsible for the risks and for a fruit company. Yes, and I want to know what his position was on the future of France in in African countries like Cameroon and Ivory Coast. It's a bit far from our debate and topic today. Well, I think that Westerners no longer have the monopoly of power, so there's a relative decline of the Western powers, including American, but the Africans are not crazy. You know, they're in the globalization, so they take everything that's there. They will go for Brazil, Qatar, whatever, China. They don't want to hear about democratic conditions and everything. So the Africans work it out that way. We can't think about Africa as a whole. It's very different depending on the countries. In the specific case of Sahel, I think Hollande, the President Hollande, was right to respond to the call for help with a regime that was threatened on demand of this regime and the Security Council. So we're right to move in, but we shouldn't have stayed after. Same mistake as the U.S. in Afghanistan. You know, that wasn't a good idea. So it depends. We can't put on Africa, have for Africa considerations like development help, AIDS. We have to work on to measure custom solutions. Think not only of France and Africa, but we have to think about Europe and Africa. Be very pragmatic on these issues. And if I can say one more thing on the previous question, sometimes we agree with Pierre and sometimes we disagree, but in my opinion, if we want to recover our influence and be able to defend ourselves, democracies have to regain their efficiency. That they can decide something. Recently, there was a fascinating debate in India where Indian intellectual said there's a problem in our country because we've been talking about the Bombay-Delhi highway expressway that still doesn't exist. And in the meantime, China did built 350 super highways. No, we can't adopt the Chinese regime that is monstrous. Yes, okay, but the Indian democracy has to recover its democracy, so it's trivial. So, okay, if democracy doesn't become a religion or with exaggerations, but if it works, it sends us back to this, we have to have a historical compromise between the elite and the people. You can't re-educate the people, but you have to strike a deal. And if we do that, we can respond in a more optimistic way to the question, will we defend, will we recover our influence, will we radiate again? Otherwise, we won't manage. So this goes back to internal questions we should address in our countries. So not much time. Unfortunately, I can't ask you to conclude. What do we have, 3 minutes? Wow. So very briefly, in a nutshell, Khadija Salami, to conclude, a few seconds. You're done. No, a few seconds. Well, okay. I just wanted to say that to fight against the injustice, we have to take risks. It's my case, but there's no excuse for not continuing. It's important to follow our hearts, to follow what our hearts tells us. Pierre BUHLER, I will call philosophy to help Thomas Hobbes 500 years ago. He says, when there's no rule of law, nothing is unjust. Friedrich Nietzsche, who borrowed from Dostoevsky, if God doesn't exist, everything is allowed. Nietzsche said, if nothing is true, everything's permitted. Adam Price.
Well, I'm just saying that I'm very happy to join the fight on behalf of democracy and the values that we've been discussing. I do believe that fiction can change people, and people can change the world. So let's do that.
Hubert VEDRINE.
Hubert VEDRINE? No, you already said, so we'll leave the last words to Pablo Picasso. When he painted Guernica, he said, painting is not meant to decorate apartments. It's a war instrument. It's a weapon, defensive and offensive weapon against the enemy. Thank you for taking part in these sessions. Thank you very much.